Welcome to The Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, I'm joined by Connor Kelly, author of a new book called The Fullness of Free Time, a theological account of leisure and recreation in the moral life. The book is published by Georgetown University Press, the sponsor of this series. Connor is an assistant professor of theology at Marquette University. His book, which he traces back to a fateful conversation with a friend in college about how to spend their fall break, explores how we can examine and recalibrate our free time to positively influence our relationships with family, friends, and our communities. Using a fascinating blend of psychology and philosophy grounded in traditional Catholic thinking, it situates leisure time as an ethical pursuit rather than one where we spend it mindlessly binging Netflix. The book is divided between a scholarly exploration of the moral potential for free time and practical applications to some of the most popular ways people spend it: television, digital media, spectator sports, and travel. In this final episode, Connor and I spend time talking about those practical applications, boiling down the scholarly concepts and determining whether the ways in which we typically spend our free time can be influenced by a moral approach. So in the last section of your book, it examines some of the more popular ways people spend their free time. Television, digital media, and spectator sports, for example. And then applies the principle of everyday solidarity to see how one might rethink these activities to achieve more fulfilling outcomes. So let's start with television, which, as you note, is the number one free time activity. And for starters, it immediately clashes with everyday solidarity's emphasis on relationships and also has a negative impact on the concept of flow. Is there a way out for television? I mean, can you watch TV and sort of practice the concept of everyday solidarity?
Goodness gracious, I hope so, based on the ways that I still watch TV.
Right,
I would say, well, actually, to get into this, I should probably back up for a moment and note that part of the applications of everyday solidarity and to the theological understanding of leisure and recreation also includes the claim that leisure ought to be prioritized over recreation because theologically intrinsic goods would have more significance than instrumental ones. It's not across the board a sort of exclusive priority or an absolute priority that would then really create no space for recreation at all. That's not something that I wish to say or that I think would be appropriate theologically. So that kind of shapes the analysis of television by saying, okay, here is the number one free time activity. And I pulled data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics American Time Use Survey. And when you kind of they break it out by different demographics. So it's age, it's sex, it's educational attainment, it's a host of different things. And for all of their demographic breakdowns, television is the number one activity. And then I think there might be one exception to that. If you're a really young kid, you might play more video games. And then across all of those, it dwarfs whatever comes second. I mean, it's more than double for everybody, basically. Mm-hmm. And so just looking at that spread of data, I basically say, this is not really in line with the principle of everyday solidarity, which would include a priority of leisure over recreation. I'm not saying you can never watch TV, but it probably should not hold this outsized chunk of our free time that it does right now.
Okay.
If we were to actually say we think about leisure first, because as you note, the kind of analysis of television, done a lot of it by Csikszentmihalyi himself, is that it's almost inimical to flow. It just is virtually impossible for people to experience that balance between challenge and skill set when watching television, because TV is such a passive activity. It requires so little from a viewer. And it's true, the way that he kind of articulates this in one of his books to highlight it is by comparing it to reading, which we also think of as a very passive activity. But there's so much information processing that goes on in reading that doesn't happen when we watch TV, because we're just getting visual stimulus and auditory stimulus, and it just kind of blends in our brain and we can just sit there and take it in. And you get the trance view of children watching a screen, or grown-ups watching a screen too, I guess.
Right.
So that's kind of one piece of it. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's trance versus flow. I mean,
that's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the other piece is, well, what sort of effects does it have on our relationships? So while there's reason to be apprehensive about the amount of time people are spending watching television for what that says about how we've sort of flipped the priority, we've put recreation ahead of leisure, there's also reason to be concerned because it doesn't really allow us to connect with others and flourish in our relationships. And I talk about how the increase of television time displaces some of our other relational activities like socializing. And to do that, I look at Robert Putnam's work about the kind of influence of television on social capital. And then with that, speaking of Putnam, I also highlight the ways that it really has a corrosive effect on our engagement in community and the kind of community bonds around us, what Putnam would just kind of describe as social capital. And so I sort of lay out all the ways this might not be great. But then I don't end up saying, turn off your TV and just take the sledgehammer out or something.
Yeah.
I try and give a little bit more realistic guidance. And the way that I frame the application of the principle of everyday solidarity here is so proprietary that you should all go buy the book right now and read it that I can't tell you. But I'll do you a solid regardless and say that it comes down to thinking about Putnam's applications where he says, trying to trace the decline of social capital has this really strong correlation with the temporal, I can't remember what the right word is here, but the spread of television across the United States, basically, into households across the United States, and permeation, I guess. And he says, from all of the different categories of questions that they try to use and correlate with social capital, the question that was the most revealing was whether somebody said watching television was their primary form of entertainment. And as he articulates in Bowling Alone, that was far and away the number one thing that predicted a decrease in engagement in the community and thus the kind of bonds that build social capital for an individual more than anything else. And so sort of piggybacking on that, I say, well, if we really are thinking about the principle of everyday solidarity as this promotion of relational flourishing, then we ought to try and take that empirical data point and avoid getting ourselves in a situation where we really do answer that watching television is our primary form of entertainment. And we kind of dial back the amount of time we spend and then think about ways to use the TV time to build some relationships. So watching a show with friends and discussing the show, which, you know, contemporary TV kind of lends itself to in a lot of ways because it's got these complicated story arcs and other things.
And really, that's not too much to ask of people. Just go out and talk about it with your friends. Try that.
Yeah, that's right. You're not sure how to connect with people. Talk about the TV you're watching. Because based on the data I've seen, they're watching it too.
Yeah, exactly. We have that in common. So I suppose if we're not watching TV, then we're interacting with digital media in some way.
In many cases, we're doing both of those things at the same time.
At the same time, exactly. But I mean, it seems that digital media may have more potential in this context. But, you know, I think you note one of the major downsides of digital media is we tend to participate in it too uncritically, which I think our academic library community would agree with 100% in terms of you know, all you know, fake news and information literacy and all that kind of thing. And but you know, obviously digital media is a big umbrella term, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the elements of digital media that you focus on in your book.
In the book, I kind of make the argument that digital media is probably the second most common use of free time. And that requires a little bit of nuance because it challenges some of the data that comes out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics American Time Use Survey. And I argue that it's probably more persuasive to think about digital media use because of the way that we multitask and how if you're sitting with somebody and you're on your smartphone together, and then a survey person asks you how you're using your free time, and your options are socializing or playing games on your computer, you're going to be like, oh, definitely socializing. Like I was right next to that person, and we nodded at each other, so that was definitely a social experience. And I just when you include the multi-tasking data, it's really clear that time with screens, tracking with our anecdotal experience, time with screens really is a very common way of using free time. So I then think about digital media really as that kind of umbrella catch-all for time with screens that would go beyond watching video. So I track internet video, really treat that like television, because I think the medium there is less important than the actual what you're doing, which is you're just passively taking in visual data as a video or something. So that's kind of in that category. And then this is everything else we do with screens that's not watching a video, which includes playing video games. And I kind of talk about how there's actually a lot of data to show video games can be conducive to flow, and then think about the impact of the content of video games, like violent video games, and the way that shapes relational capacities. And so how the content of games, and then the context, whether you're playing with other people or individually alone, how that kind of all shapes ways of thinking relationally about video games. And then I also spend a lot of time talking about social media, which is the kind of biggest chunk of what people do with the internet online, because of the clickbait and the newsfeed rabbit holes and all of those things.
Right.
So I try and kind of pull those things out and then look at, well, how does this work relationally? And at least in the context of social media, I talk about, well, oftentimes we use online experiences not exactly to fulfill relationships. Just if anybody's read a comment section anywhere, you know what I'm talking about. And how do we challenge some of that? And so in the context of this chapter, I will pull in ideas from Pope Francis, who had a kind of fascinating speech on World Communications Day. This was 2014, I think, maybe 15, I'm forgetting now. And really talks about what it means to pursue solidarity. He calls it an authentic culture of encounter online. And so try to kind of capture some of that and say, can we be more intentional about the fact that when we post things, we're communicating with other human beings, and maybe not forget that there's another person on the other end, and that we should be a little bit less cruel, I guess.
Right.
But then I also talk about the ways that we kind of use social media as a stand-in for social connection, and that undermines our relationships in that it displaces some of those face-to-face interactions or those fuller engagements. I mean, there's something about asynchronous communication that would be asynchronous communication on social media, where you post something and then hours later somebody else responds to you, or even if it's minutes later, it's still not an immediate, we're all in this together in the same way that a phone conversation would be, for instance. And so it has this kind of effect of displacing some of our relationships. Time we would otherwise spend with people, we're now directing online. And that can be kind of corrosive to our communities too, in much the same way that television's erosion of social capital can harm our connections. And then I also kind of get into the ways that our tendency to do some of these things online undermines our actual capacity to connect to people together. And I'm sure that the academic librarians will appreciate what I'm saying as a college professor, which is I know from talking with my students and things that they've said about their experiences that they often find it hard to have kind of spontaneous conversations with people around them, either because someone's on their phone and so they can't interrupt them and there's no way of talking to them or even acknowledging that they're in the same space, or because if they happen to both have their phones down, no one would know what to do. They're not sure how to build that conversation. And I found the work of Sherry Turkle, the psychologist who teaches at MIT and really delves into the effects of tech on our communication, to be really effective at making sense of what I have been kind of able to see on campuses.
And I also wanted to sort of dig in a little bit with the section on spectator sports, and we can use football as an example, mainly because you related a personal anecdote about, I think as any parent does, your struggles with watching it. Can you elaborate on those thoughts? And by parent, I mean, as we kind of ponder the possibility or impossibility of our children playing the sport, and so kind of elaborate on sort of your own stories and thoughts around football as a spectator sport.
And that was a really personal one for me because I went to Notre Dame, and there happens to be a football team there. Most people don't know this, but they actually have one, and it becomes a pretty big part of the whole experience, of course. So, I was really enjoying football as a Notre Dame student, and then after Notre Dame, after I graduated, there was this kind of explosion of research into the effects of football in the NFL and concussions, and I became more and more attuned to that. And I ultimately recall I got to a point where I was ambivalent about football, but I was still kind of watching. I wouldn't totally, like, especially a Notre Dame game. I mean, I would probably find a way to watch a Notre Dame game. And I remember having a conversation when, just after my wife and I had found out that she was pregnant with our son, who's our second child, and I was having a conversation with my colleague, also a theologian, and he was talking about his son, who was, I guess, about 6 months older than my son. No, a year and a half older than my son. And he was saying, yeah, when they found out that they were having a son, it was kind of interesting to then think about, like, well, what about football? He was somebody who played hockey, so he kind of thought about it first in hockey, and then was thinking about football because they were getting invited to watch football. And he and his wife both said, yeah, there's no way I would let my son play football. And the more I thought about it with him on the phone, I said, there's absolutely no way I would let my son play football. And in that moment, I was like, oh my gosh, if I'm not going to let my son play football because I think it's just too dangerous for his well-being, how can I in good conscience sit down and watch other people's sons play football when I'm saying this is a horrendous thing, no one should be? So that for me was kind of emblematic of the insights that the virtue of everyday solidarity, or excuse me, the principle of everyday solidarity is supposed to give us when we think about free time. Here's a free time activity that we often think about as at a distance, but taking this fact of solidarity as a reality and saying, I need to think morally about that. I'm connected to the people playing football because they're playing for my entertainment. That's why there is a spectator sport. The spectator is kind of essential to that. Because if you're playing the sport, I think it's a different conversation in that tends to induce flow. And so it's more in the leisure category and can have different things going on. But a spectator sport really builds a relationship and implies a relational connection. So what I wanted to get at is both in terms of the analysis of spectator sports, what sort of relationships are you building with your spectators, but also what's demanded of you morally from the relationship that exists with the people participating in the sport you watch. And football for me was the kind of case in point of saying there are some sports that structurally we want to say really problematic. And for that reason, it becomes an issue morally just to kind of stand idly by. And I kind of make a contrast between, like, I don't want to be paternalistic here. I don't want to say, if you're a spectator and you're watching, you need to decide what's best for somebody else out there. And the kind of counterpoint is I talk about the documentary Free Solo about, I think his name is Alex Honnold, this crazy climber who will just climb up stuff without ropes. It's amazing. The documentary is about his ascent of El Capitan, and he's the first human to try and do it free solo without any supporting gear. And I just recall his mother in the documentary basically saying, he is most alive when he's doing that, and I'm not going to stop him. And so I kind of wanted to be able to say, look, there's things that are really dangerous. Like, don't get me wrong, free solo is insane. That's real dangerous, real risky. But I don't think it's appropriate to say, hey, you can't possibly take on that risk because of the way that his mother was looking at that. I mean, if anybody wanted him to make it, it was her. And she's saying, look, I'm not going to take this happiness, this goodness away from him. So that's something that I wanted to kind of keep in tension. I think in Honnold's case, he's really, really careful about what he's doing. So it's, there's a way of minimizing the risk. But in football, I felt like there's just something so intrinsic to the sport itself, the way that it is played with these pads and what that sport is, that I cannot, based on the research that I've seen about concussions, imagine a way that football could be played safely and minimizing the risks of the concussion and the kind of traumatic brain injury over time, the CTE effects and all these other things, without it not being football anymore. It would be something else. And I'm okay with it being something else personally, but it's not right now. And because of that, I don't feel like I can watch it. I feel like I would be violating the principle of everyday solidarity. I would not be concerned really about the well-being of the people I was watching.
Right. This might be splitting hairs, but I'm wondering if that thinking is the same when you talk about professional sports where salary pay becomes involved. I mean, does that require any kind of different moral calculus versus what might be considered or what is a college sport or a sport where you're doing it not for pay? It's not your job, so to speak.
Yeah, I was thinking about this recently in the context of the professional sports league starting up in the middle of a pandemic and the ways that goes. I mean, this is like, oh gosh, all right, test case, everyday solidarity. What now? What now, right. Kelly? What now? And I was thinking, I was actually really fascinated. The NBA was the first league to really kind of start up. And I actually felt like they were doing things in a responsible fashion. Mm-hmm. Not just for the players, but also in a kind of socially responsible fashion, because they were investing a lot of money in this testing, which creates all these larger questions about, well, we're not getting testing where it needs to go normally, and then we can give all these NBA players a whole bunch of tests. So there's a larger issue there. I respect that. But part of what they were doing was they were working with Yale and other universities to basically give the standard tests, but also test saliva tests and test these other things. So they were kind of using the bubble as a way of fleshing out some of the resources that we as a society need to help us through this pandemic. So when I looked at it that way, I was thinking, all right, I think there's an argument to be made for how this is going. I would need to get into some of the nitty gritty of, okay, how much flexibility do individual players have? And it seemed like people were able to kind of say, based on my family situation or whatever, I'm not going to do this right now. But I think that's important. And then I was struck by the way that the Big Ten, and I live in Wisconsin, so this is something that comes up from time to time, just made their decision to have football. They initially were going to postpone, and then they said, well, I mean, yeah, so they said, let's do this again.
Let's do it.
I was going to say I can envision all numbers of reasons, but I won't get into that. So that for me is a different kind of analysis in terms of everyday solidarity, because I think that actually imposes something on those players. I think there's a bigger structural constraint on the college athlete than there is on the professional athlete, who both has the salary and could conceivably say, okay,
opt out.
I'm going to eat this one. I'm just not going to get that $10 million this year or whatever it is, which obviously is a lot of money to turn down. So there's a constraining feature there. But that gets into the virtue of everyday solidarity about how much we're paying athletes and how I think that's problematic. So that's a structural dimension of spectator sports, not to be left aside. Go read the book. But on the college side, I just feel like there's a different set of constraints. I think it's a lot harder for a college student to say, yep, I'm not going to play football this time, because many of them, recognize that if they don't play football, then a potential $1 million contract is disappearing, or multi-million-dollar contract. And B, they might have issues with graduating and finishing degrees and other things. So I'm sure a lot of schools are trying to address that element, but even if they are, there's just a lot of pressures and a lot of constraints on a student athlete who does not have the additional resources already in the area to make different choices. And I think it's important to make that distinction and think about that in terms of this principle.
Right. Excellent. Okay, well, that's all the time we have. Connor Kelly, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Bill.
You just heard from Connor Kelly, Assistant Professor of Theology at Marquette University and author of the new book, The Fullness of Free Time, A Theological Account of Leisure and Recreation in the Moral Life, published by Georgetown University Press, the sponsor of this series. If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.